Now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Roger L. Martinez-Davila is professor of history at the University of Colorado Springs. His first monograph, Creating Conversos, the Carvajal Santa Maria family in early modern Spain, was published by the University of Notre Dame Press in 2018. From 2014 to 2017, he served as guest curator for the New Mexico History Museum in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and its exhibition, Fractured Faiths, Spanish Judaism, the Inquisition, and New World Identities, 2016. During 2015 through 2018, he served as a European Commission Marie Curie Fellow at the Universidad de Carlos III, where he initiated his Deciphering Secrets project, a citizen science project focused on the transcription of medieval manuscripts pertaining to Jewish, Christian, and Muslim interrelations. Presently, he co-directs an NEH Institute for Advanced Topics in the Digital Humanities titled Immersive Global Middle Ages, which empowers traditional humanists to create their own virtual reality worlds that reveal the Middle Ages through different religious and cultural lenses.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So again, I'm Roger Martinez-Dávila. I'd also just like to say that originally, like a lot of folks in the room, this is my, not that this is your second career, it's probably going to be your first career. I started off in public policy. So I have a master's in public policy from UC Berkeley. Worked in think tanks in Silicon Valley, forecasting the future of healthcare. I also did work in criminal justice for many years, doing work on how to work with juvenile substance abusers in the criminal justice system and how to kind of get them back on track. So my heart is with y'all, with all the folks that kind of the criminal justice, public policy, everybody that's working there. And in this respect, I'm super excited to visit with y'all because I'm a historian now, and that's where most of my work is. But I'm really interested in the public, and I think you're interested in the public. You're interested in maybe having a positive impact on the society around you. So what I'm asking you to do is at times, maybe check out my presentation and let your mind wander a little bit about, well, what would I like to do? How would I like to change the world around me? If it kind of sparks some idea about how you would do something different, maybe latch onto that. I think that's the purpose of the university environment, and even the Daniels Fund Ethics Initiative, which is to kind of facilitate these kinds of conversations, to kind of cross-pollinate different types of ideas. So in any case, I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm one of those professors that actually does believe in using a lot of technology. So I'm, kind of full disclosure in the transparency kind of perspective. I did this in collaboration with OpenAI's DALL-E 3, which is an image generator, and then also with ChatGPT-4. So what I find them particularly useful to use for is not to do your homework or to write a presentation for you, but to help refine ideas, and also just to take the essence of what you have, your own ideas, and fully develop those, and to kind of fill in some of the gaps, or sometimes to manage what you don't know. So it can help in those ways, and you'll see some of this. So, okay, so just want to talk about the importance of citizen science in the digital humanities. So basically, in the past, this was the world that I come from, which is these are monks in a scriptorium copying books so they could be distributed across the world. And in this case, we're kind of moving into a new era where now scholars are moving really into this digital environment where we're like working with digital documents really more specifically. I think what's important to recognize is that really, if you think about it, a manuscript is just a type of technology, just like a computer. And I'd ask you that this is where I do my work around citizen sciences. If you ask yourself, what's a more robust technology? Would you say it's electronic information or information on paper? So just a real quick show of hands, who thinks that paper is more robust? Okay, who thinks electronic is more robust? Okay. Who knows what a floppy disk is? Who can use a floppy disk still in this room? Not many people, right? Well, guess what? A manuscript that's 1,000 years old, you can still use it. 1,000 years later, we can still look at the document and access it. So in this respect, what's more robust? A floppy disk from 20 years ago or 1,000-year-old manuscripts? This is where we kind of have to start to invert our thinking sometimes, which is we kind of take for granted that the world we live in is the most robust, the most advanced in the world, and it's not. And in this respect, that's where we have to find this balance between the old and the new. And as we move forward, like right now, as we start to think about how will we start to work as digital humanists to create like digital models working with AI in this respect. And how do we do this with transparency, with trust, with all those elements? So I'm going to just give you kind of an overview of what this Deciphering Secrets project is all about, what I've been doing. And it's about unlocking the manuscripts of medieval Spain. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit about the history of Spain, just so you know, because my expectations, you know nothing about it. And then we'll talk about different ethical issues in terms of how do you engage like the public and working on stuff together with you, especially when you're not paying them to do something. Is that fair? Is that right? To say, oh, help me do my homework, and then like, all right, bye. So that's kind of a thing. So I think I will probably narrate this real quick and see if this works.
The three Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, once shared the Iberian Peninsula for 800 years. Why does this time and place, medieval Iberia, so profoundly intrigue us, confound us? Do we see ourselves today struggling with the same issues of religious intolerance and cultural purity, a pervasive need to separate us from them? Deciphering Secrets delves into pressing issues of medieval coexistence. It also teaches you how to read medieval manuscripts so that we can make new scholarly discoveries. We explore the medieval cities of Burgos, Toledo, and Granada, the impact of plague, civil war, and religious conversion, the wonder of the revival of Greek knowledge via Muslim intermediaries. We witness the implementation of the Inquisition and discriminatory blood purity laws, and the completion of the Reconquista and the expulsion of Jews and Muslims. We ask, how did Jews, Christians, and Muslims, and recent converts to Christianity adapt to their changing world in the late medieval world? You will learn to transcribe medieval handwriting, and together we will decipher new secrets.
They actually had a full team to work with. It was about 6 people. Usually I'm recording stuff. The most recent stuff I record, surprisingly, is right on an iPhone, which is kind of some of the best kind of capturing technology now. So basically what I do is I teach online courses called massive online courses to kind of help people understand this interreligious heritage. You can kind of see kind of why it matters still, because you know everything that's happening in the Middle East today, these are pervasive issues. They're not going away. So perhaps maybe by looking at the past, we can think about the future. And more specifically, one of the big challenges in terms of what we call citizen science, which means integrating like everyday folks, whether they're students or retired parents or grandparents, whoever, is to kind of like figure out how can we like share that process of discovery. And I think what you'll find out like yourselves is that long after you graduated, there's still going to be that kind of kernel of imagination and interest in your world. So you'll go to museums, you'll go to plays, you'll travel. And in that respect, I try to find folks like you after they've graduated to say like, hey, by day, I'm kind of managing like this local business, but at night, actually, I'm kind of interested in like kind of keeping my mind, engaged. And if anything, maybe I won't like do a crossword puzzle, or maybe I'll work on a manuscript and help find these findings from the past so that it's like a positive contribution back to society. I'm just going to say basically is that what I do is I've kind of broken my project up into like 4 different places. One is basically working with manuscripts, kind of transcribing them. One is this area called paleography. Paleography is just a really fancy word for saying reading old handwriting. So anytime you're looking at like maybe an old will or a census record on Ancestry or something like that, and it's not in our contemporary handwriting, that's paleography. I also work, obviously doing research publications. And then specifically what I'm interested in now is this project called Zooniverse. Zooniverse is an online platform that is based around ideas of like how do you engage people in science. So they'll have projects like, identifying different galaxies on different images from different telescopes, so the public can help in that way. I have a project on there that's related to Deciphering Secrets, where they're transcribing manuscripts from basically 10 different archives, trying to dig for these details of like, how do these people kind of interact during this time period? And like, how does that kind of challenge our perspectives? So, if you type in Deciphering Secrets, yes, you can find it really quickly. It's probably good that we're not going to look at it. It's in the same. So why would we be potentially interested in medieval Spain? So this is known as the Catalan Atlas. So Catalonia is right here where Barcelona is today. And it was created in 1375 by Christy Abraham, who was a Jewish cartographer that lived in Christian lands. And as you can see, the outlines, here's Spain, go up to the French Riviera. Here's Italy in its boot. And we come down to Greece, Turkey, present-day Palestine, Israel, Judea, Egypt, North Africa, Morocco. So even by 1375, they had really solid understandings of geography. And this is an actual manuscript from the period. So you can think this stuff is still there today. This is, I think, preserved in a French museum and library. But we're interested in this period because basically in Spain from 711 AD, which we also call CE, the Common Era, anytime that historians are kind of working with interreligious materials, sometimes we'll refer to it as the Common Era because what we do is we kind of take the religion out of the discussion of the history. So we can just say it's 2023 of the Common Era. We're not referring back to Jesus Christ, and in that way we can kind of have a more kind of maybe sometimes a balanced discussion. So this was done in 1375, but in any case, between 711 and 1492, 8 centuries, Jews, Christians, and Muslims lived in medieval Spain under Christian rule sometimes under Islamic rule. And what's really kind of interesting about it is that everything happened. Everything from mixed religion families to horrible wars, all these types of things. And we're going to look now at just some quick history of it. So these are DALL-E generated images, just to kind of like capture some of the elements of medieval Spain. Kind of medieval Spain kind of like really, or I should say Spain really kind of comes into the historical record when the Phoenicians, so the Phoenicians are from Lebanon, they were a trading empire and they built all across the Mediterranean world and they created outposts everywhere. Probably as early as like 1000 BCE, before the Common Era. We actually have Phoenicians that have traveled to Spain and they're mixing of all things because we think of Spain as like, oh, those are like Spanish, Latin peoples. Where actually there were Celtic peoples here as well as indigenous Iberians. And what's so cool about Spain is some of the earliest writings we have or like cave paintings we have actually come from caves in northern Spain. So it's one of these places that probably for tens of thousands of years has been a crossroads of many different types of peoples. It creates a kind of really kind of dynamic environment. When the Phoenicians also came with them were Jewish traders, and they also kind of found themselves there as early as that 8th century before the Common Era. This is kind of important because we find out is that this will become a very unique kind of Jewish community in relationship to other communities in the world. What happens then is, you probably heard of those folks, the Romans. Well, they had like a really horrible enemy called the Carthaginians, who were the descendants of the Phoenicians. And there were huge battles in the 3rd century before the Common Era between the Carthaginians and the Romans to take control. And so in this respect, you may have heard of like Hannibal, and he has elephants that are crossing the Alps to try to attack. So those are the Carthaginians. The Romans end up winning out. And then this is what we're going to enter this period of Pax Romana, when the peace of the Roman time period, where it expands all across Europe and the Mediterranean world, kind of creating a stabilizing force, but also some destabilization as well around religion. And what you can kind of, in this respect, is think about probably, roughly by, about the time of, the birth of Christ, Iberia, Rome, Constantinople, which is today Istanbul, as far away as southern England, we had basically Roman civilization, which kind of really facilitated the development of writing, legal systems, common language, Latin, really sophisticated work with sciences and technology, and almost like this kind of common architectures. But also there was just a real mixing of people. So you might have, at this time, you don't have Muslims yet because Islam has not been born as a faith. But there would have been Jews, there would have been different folks that practiced Christianity after the birth of Christ. But also, like a good friend of mine who is a Roman historian, he studies the cult of Mithra. The cult of Mithra is the cult of the bull, and Roman centurions all across the Roman world had these subterranean temples where they kind of like reflected on the strength of the bull, but also there were ritual sacrifices of bulls and things like that. And all across basically Europe, you would find almost like, in some ways, almost like fraternity houses that would like facilitate these kind of common brotherhoods. What's kind of neat about it, to think about it, is that old concept of like, that belief in the bull, you kind of see it running through even like Spain and its like bullfighting traditions, which are complicated, obviously. But even today, which is, you have the Chicago Bulls, you have, I'm from Texas, the Texas Longhorns. These are all kind of like very, very deep stories that kind of permeate kind of our histories. So, and those come from all different cultures. Sometimes we're unaware of them. They're not just European cultures. They're from Asia, from Africa, even the New World. What I can say is that what was difficult about Spain was when the Romans actually were forcing other communities, religious communities, to kind of follow the cult of the emperor, which meant the emperor of Rome had to be treated as a god himself. And in this respect, the Jews in Judea revolted against the Romans. And as a result of that, in 70 CE, the Second Temple, where you see the Temple Mount today, where the Alaska Mosque is now, they destroyed the temple and they forcibly deported all Jewish communities, creating a huge influx of Jews into Spain again, but also helping to build up in an outcome that's different, the development of an Ashkenazi Jewish community inside of Western Europe, kind of this dispersal. So kind of one of the issues that comes out of like medieval Spain are issues that are really contemporary to our period, which is about issues of migration, displacement, competition for resources. In that respect, if you think about like public policy or even criminal justice, a lot of times it's about, unequal distribution of wealth, competition for limited resources, senses that like I'm not being treated fairly by a legal system. So these are all kind of issues that kind of repeat themselves. Around 711, just to mention, Muslims come in to Spain. They conquer it within about 20 years. And what's really quite interesting is that they establish a really robust civilization. They create a caliphate. The caliphate is only just an integration of religious and political institutions. So in the same way in Western Europe, we used to have kings and the Pope, and that was that separation of the two parts of power, secular and ecclesiastical. And inside of Islam, they integrate the two. Just like in Europe, they're very closely aligned, but just slightly different. But they created these incredible places like the city of Cordoba. This is a depiction of it. It's not an actual one, but it would have these minarets. At the time of right around 1000 CE, about 600,000 people lived in this city. It's one of the largest cities in the world. They had libraries that had almost 1 million manuscripts in them. There were hundreds of public baths. They actually had running water and sewer systems. And generally speaking, it was a pretty decent place to live. One German nun who visited it during its height, who's a Christian nun, obviously she called it the ornament of the world. Because it was like, this is crazy. This is really nice. Because a contemporary like European city at the time, a city might be 5,000 people. A metropolis might be 20,000. So something of this scale was really unusual. Obviously, history is not always particularly fun or interesting or in a good way. What happens though is after the Muslims are there for a number of 500 years, there's a significant effort inside Christian communities to the north to fight and retake parts of Iberia, which is known as the Reconquista or Reconquest. It's a war that lasts for eons. What's unusual about it is that it's not necessarily like the civilizational conflict you would expect. It wasn't necessarily always Christian kingdoms against Muslim kingdoms. It's actually about political power. Sometimes you had Christian noblemen fighting for Islamic kingdoms because that was the best partnership. Or in another case, there would be a civil war in one kingdom in Christian Spain, and that king that got kicked out would go take refuge with Muslims in an Islamic kingdom. Very complicated. And that's what was the idea behind citizen science, which is we know the big trend lines, but what about the facts on the ground on a daily basis? And what we kind of found out is you start to move further into history, just like we had a pandemic that kind of ran through a rampage through our world. In the 1300s, there was the Black Plague. So massive deaths, lots of finger pointing at who caused those deaths. And actually just a reorganization of society, just the way we're seeing it today. What I'm going to do is just kind of advance a little bit and get to this slide because I want to be cognizant of time. Where this ends really is around 1492, when we're getting close to the birth of nations. Nation states won't come in around to the 1700s, but kingdoms are really defined. By 1492, Spain is unified under a Christian crown between Ferdinand and Isabella, who you've heard of. And this is one of the craziest things that I can't imagine ever living in 1492, because imagine in 1492, Spain reconquers all of its territories, becomes an integrated Catholic country, but with Muslims and Jews underneath it. But then quickly they decide the same year, we're going to expel all Jewish communities. They expel 300,000 Jews to say you have to leave or convert. And the last that same year, Christopher Columbus encounters the Americas. If you think of like a corollary for us, it would be like the United States and the idea of manifest destiny, that, not that we have any intention of doing this, that the United States conquers Canada and Mexico, and it becomes the consolidated United States and North America. It would be like we decide that we are going to target one religious group and say everybody has to leave that same year. And lastly, it is as if like we had traveled to another world, like Mars, and encountered a whole new civilization. All that happened in 1 year. So, you know, big momentous things kind of happen like that, and they kind of tear at societies. Where did they go? Jews, some went to the Americas as secret Jews, some retreated into Islamic territories, some converted by choice and by not choice, by being forced into Christianity, and those often were targeted by the Inquisition. The Inquisition could then decide if you were technically a Christian, then we can really look into your background. Are you really a good Christian? You know, and there are all kinds of different ways. So I would just advise you not to wash your clothes on Fridays, because that would be a sign potentially that you're a Jew. Very, very unusual rules. So this is just supposed to be a depiction of like, okay, now we've done a little bit of what is citizen science. We've done a little bit about what's history. Okay, now let's move towards the ethics and move towards, you know, how do we engage people in discussions? So this is supposed to be, in this sense, we see, you know, the scholar here working with different citizen scientists of the medieval age. And really what we're doing is we're grabbing manuscripts and we're reading individual documents to see what's in them. So for instance, this is the crazy stuff I teach. This handwriting over here. This is from the late 1300s. So let me see, can anyone read that date there? 1391. Okay, you're all officially paleographers. Congratulations. What I found out is with 2 weeks of instruction, almost everybody in this room would be able to see about 80 to 90% of the script. The reason why this works, we did peer review articles on this, is think about it this way. If you go to Egypt today and you were to go visit like a pyramid, you would see like symbols on it, right? Like all kinds of hieroglyphics. You wouldn't necessarily know what it said, but you could recognize the symbols. Same way in like Mesoamerica. If you were to see Mayan pictographs, you might not be able to read them and see what they say, but you can recognize the symbols. Humans are really great symbol evaluators. So you might not understand Spanish, but you probably could learn how people wrote different things at that time period. And then by transcribing those, then we can create translations and figure out what's going on. So this one is from the archive in the Cathedral of Burgos. It's from 1391, and one of these records is probably this one right here. What it tells you is about what are the facts on the ground, and this is why I really wanted to engage the public in citizen sciences. Well, one of these records here talks about the Catholic Church, and it says in 1391, the church in Burgos decides they have to do repairs to one of the chapels. And what they specify that really specifically is, we are going to pay a certain number of silver pieces to do this work. They were called maravedis. And they say very specifically, be sure you hire Hamed Abid, who is a Muslim carpenter. It'll say it in the record. And it says, make sure you hire him. And if you can't hire him, make sure you hire a Muslim carpenter. What it tells you is that everybody had their place in society. And what Christian communities understood was, we want the best. The best people to do the work is a Muslim carpenter. So this is just kind of a Dali generation of Hamed working with the cathedral staff, you know, over, okay, what are the types of modifications we're going to make here? And in this respect, they're very these are respectful relationships. So even though technically Christians would see Muslims and Jews as a lesser kind of community because of their faith, they can also simultaneously be superior in their skill sets and their expertise, and then, you know, just the reliability. So that doesn't quite fit with what we've been taught, that like these people hated each other. Another one that we can look at is this one. This is from the cathedral in Toledo. This looks very similar to the modern cathedral that was built in the 1200s. It's kind of modern for me. My colleague Jaime Alvar, when I first met him, and he's one of the colleagues I work in Madrid who does Mithraism. When I first met him in 2015, he says, "Can you remind me again like what you study?" He's like, "Oh, I do Middle Ages in Spain." And he's a Roman historian. He looks at me and he says, "Noticias, the news." It's way too early. It's not really history yet, Roger. And it's kind of funny, everything's always kind of relative. But in Toledo, in this select building here, we have another record here. And so we'll have things like here, this says Don Yusef. So Don is an honorific title, which means Lord. Yusef is the Jewish name for Joseph. So again, this is a really weird thing that's happening. So in this Christian record, it's talking about Lord Joseph, who's a Jewish noble inside of this community. That means he is above other Christians in terms of status and social status, and economic status. But he would be lower than Christians in terms of religious status. In this record, what we find is Don Yusef and his wife, Dona Hamiya, are actually going to manage for the church vineyards, because as you can imagine, Spain is an important place for production of wine. And so often the church has all this property it can't manage. So they turn to the most sophisticated operators, the best merchants, the best people to do the job. And they basically say, what we're going to do is we're going to lease out these lands to you. They have the vineyards for the next, 20 years. And in return, go pay these rents. And then, you make the profit you can make off of them. And so here is Don Yusef meeting with churchmen to make those arrangements. Again, kind of a contradictory of what we would expect. So that's really what we can kind of find in these documents. So let's talk about how this plays out to Daniel's Fund Ethics Initiative. And I'm sure that you'll be very happy that I'm going to talk about these now. So let's talk about some of the different principles, and I'll ask you to kind of interrupt me along the way. The first issue is this idea of the application of integrity, right? So again, working with Dali, I was trying to say, I wanted to showcase kind of like the history of the period, but also these ideas. So in this kind of fictitious oil painting is set in a medieval Spanish scriptorium. That's where they're copying documents, scripts. Diverse scholars, including a Christian priest, a Muslim imam, and a Jewish rabbi, are diligently working together on transcribing and interpreting in a shared manuscript. Each brings their own religious text to cross-reference, ensuring the integrity and accuracy of their collective work. Above them, a decorative archway displays symbols from each of the three religions, signifying unity and collaboration. So this is kind of really about the citizen science stuff, which is when we're working with other people that might be volunteering their time to help us, how do we do that with integrity? And that is to kind of basically listen to the people around you. So a lot of times when I work with citizen scientists, they were like retired engineers or they're retired botanists, and they'll come across something and say, no, there's something really interesting here. It's talking about like a special plant. And like one of the special plants we encountered was a special plant that was just noted as a marker on a property boundary. And it said it was a stand of black walnut trees. And I was like, that's really weird. Like, why would you just name black walnut trees? And then after it said that in Spanish, good for the treatment of scrofula. I was like, I don't even know what that is. That sounds weird and I don't want it. Turns out scrofula was skin tuberculosis. And what our medieval counterparts had learned at that time period was the oil from black walnut trees could be used as an antibiotic to treat tuberculosis. Turns out, contemporary medical research confirms that there are these antibiotic properties inside of black walnut oil. So they might have not had a really full understanding of the sciences. They just knew it worked. So in that respect, it's kind of listening to the people that you're working with. If they're a different faith, they're a different kind of profession, if they're of a different background economically or politically, is to basically say, well, everybody has a say in this, and we have to treat each other kind of fairly, listen to each other. So think about that, and that's where I would ask you now, if you're going to start to check out, if you haven't already, which I hope you have maybe along the way, start to let your mind kind of wander a little bit about what does integrity look like in the work that you're doing? How does it play out as you think about the studies that you're doing, whether it's thinking about the proper treatment of folks that are incarcerated, how legal systems work, how do we make sure that we treat people equally and equitably, things like that. Another principle that we work with is just the application of trust. So again, I'm really appreciative of this opportunity to work on this because it made me go back and think about the work I've been doing. So here, this is obviously another fictitious depiction of a medieval Spanish research hall or library. Scholars and citizens gather around a large table that displays various scrolls and manuscripts. A large banner overhead reads "Trust and Research." Some scholars are openly sharing their ideas with each other, pointing to different diagrams and charts and things like that. And others are kind of whispering, hiding their scrolls, kind of symbolizing kind of the lack of transparency. Those are the edges of the corners. So, this is the contrast that we have to figure out, which is how do we build trust with the communities we're working with? How do we signal to them that we value their work and that we'll be honest with other people around us? So when I generally publish anything around the work here, I always kind of cite the citizen scholars I'm working with. It's too difficult to name them all because at this point, there have been about 50,000 people that have taken the courses that I've taught. So you can't name everyone, but you can, in the sense, acknowledge, the efforts of all these different individuals to making these contributions. And I think this is really important because, again, as I think back to Madrid in Spain, where I do a lot of my work, I remember a very good colleague of mine who works in one of the national research institutes was building this incredible database of manuscripts. And I was like, man, this is great, this is how long you've been around. Oh, I've been working on that for 15 years. It's excellent. I said, so what are you going to do with it? And he's like, are you going to publish it? I'm like, no, this is mine. I'm not sharing this with anyone. This is for my research. And so, in that level, it's kind of like, well, why are you doing this? How can you be more open with the rest of the world and make sure that this information is democratized? To kind of build that trust with communities to say, the reason why you want to have professors is so that they can create new knowledge, and then they should share that with you and work alongside of other people. What about accountability? Accountability, as my niece, who's 8 years old, always says, there's going to be consequences. I think accountability is about how do we make sure that we're being kind of attendant to our audiences and the people we're working with. So here, this is supposed to be an illustration of a medieval kind of Spanish courtyard. Here is the professor, the main research person, presenting findings to other researchers outside the hall. And then all the citizen scientists, kind of waiting for their opportunity to share their findings, to share what they can contribute to knowledge. And so that's, again, another place about how do we do more inclusive work? How do we provide recognition of research? And this is one of the tough things. So in some ways, when I was teaching MOOCs, students could make this implicit trade with me, which was, I'm going to teach you a free course about medieval Spain. There are going to be lots of on-site interviews with museum directors and things like that. And in return, hey, maybe you can help me transcribe some manuscripts. That's maybe a good trade, right? And then at the end of that, they would get a certificate saying they completed the course. So I think that's, we have to think about when you are engaging with other people, how are you accountable to making sure they get credit? I'd have to say I have not figured it out. I've made lots of mistakes. I think the point of doing work like this is to make lots of mistakes. Failure is the primary option you should be looking for, because through that failure, you can assess how would I do it differently again. That way I don't make that same mistake, and maybe I can resolve something for someone else. Oh, I ran into this problem. This is how to solve it. And we just have a couple more points because we're just moving down the list. Transparency, obviously, when we think about it, here's a depiction of all these scrolls that are there. And, and this idea is how do we get this information out to the world? So in this respect, through working with citizen scientists, we've created those websites I mentioned to you where we're publishing the findings through the Kramer Family Library's digital archives. So those manuscripts go there, as well as the transcriptions, unlike my colleague in that Spanish institute who doesn't share anything. The point is to get it out there so other people can use it, and then we can add to the knowledge. It's a collective enterprise. So transparency is really essential. If we think about fairness, this is supposed to be, as again, we were talking about Islamic Spain a little bit. This is a scene unfolds in a vibrant Islamic city marked by its ornate minarets, mosaic tiled courtyards. And if you've never been to Spain, you have to go. It's like the most stunning place of like, how does this stuff exist? How does it live this way? But how do you balance fairness? So in some ways, we're generating research opportunities, right? But also there has to be some kind of like recognition, those golden coins. Curiously enough, sometimes we think that AIs are not doing a very good job of depicting things. This is actually a pretty accurate depiction of how knowledge was treated in the medieval world. In Baghdad, of all places, roughly around 900 CE was a place called the House of Wisdom. And the Islamic caliphs at the time period would bring in scholars from all across the world. At that time, the known world was really the Mediterranean, but it'd be Christian scholars, Jewish scholars. But in Baghdad, the House of Wisdom, what they would do is that anytime someone could bring in a new text, an old Greek text that had never been found, maybe with Pythagoras' theorems or something, they would actually weigh it and pay the person its weight in gold because it was considered that valuable. So sometimes, AI can do some good jobs, but this is literally what they did. So in this case, how do we build those equitable relationships with our students and other kind of scholars? So in this way, it's like what I've tried to do is try to empower folks that are working in the MOOCs to become like teaching assistants or to be like experts in certain fields where like I designate them like, a lot more about this than I know. So I'm just going to hand it over to you and kind of empower you to kind of be that leader there. I think that's what fairness means, which is not kind of like taking all the credit for yourself and sharing that responsibility. Obviously, you want to talk a little bit about respect. And this oil painting, again, another kind of manifestation is a grinding halt in the royal castle, the Real Alcazar. So that is actually the Spanish for it. Real means royal, Alcazar means castle. Again, you see this integration of many worlds. Anytime you see a word in Spanish that has the AL on the front of it, that is a word that came from Arabic. It's always so in Spanish we say like a mayor is an alcalde. These are those words come from Arabic. So these languages were kind of integrated there. But here we could think about two groups of scholars of medieval origin stand on opposite sides of a wooden table, animated in debate, right? So they're here. He's sitting. So the AI just totally blew it. Some scholars are seen gesturing towards scrolls of books, and others are intently listening. So, and then it says, this ambient light filter coming through. I think, ultimately, again, this is about the other principle of, and this is what I think we get from the ethics principles, is they're all kind of overlapping, right? They're different lenses of similar concepts. And this one, I think it's about listening to the people around you, taking their points into consideration, knowing that you might disagree, and that's totally okay. That's okay. And we just have 2 more to go, so we're just about there. So thank you for hanging in there. Well, how about the application of rule of law? And I thought at first, like, this is going to be kind of hard for me, because at first I thought, well, medieval manuscripts, there's really kind of no such thing as copyright. There's none. So copyright is like a modern concept in the 1800s. In fact, in the Middle Ages, the most common way to show respect for people that have worked before you was to copy their work. So often you wouldn't cite someone else. You would use their exact words in your manuscripts, and everybody in the room would know, like, oh, he's citing St. Paul. Oh, he's citing Maimonides. It was the highest form of compliment to copy others' work. So copyright it's like, well, that's not going to quite work in this concept. There are some issues that get worked out of that about whoever takes the picture of a medieval manuscript actually owns the copyright, not necessarily the institution that owns the document. This is one of the things we figured out with council here at UCCS. But also, in this respect, it's kind of this idea of, maybe we have this distinguished medieval doctor And maybe at one time he's been given this one plant that has these medicinal properties that are very special. But he was told, you can't share this with anyone else because it's kind of like a trade secret. But what about the descendants of that plant? What about the variations of that? Is he bound by, or is she bound by the same kind of rules? So I think that takes that kind of time to kind of, you want to think about slowly about, well, who has a stake in this, right? And how do we pay attention to those stakes? How do we make sure? So often when I work with cathedrals, I enter into legal agreements with them. A lot of times the church moves very slowly, so they can't enter into legal written agreements. We enter into handshake and word of mouth agreements, and that's what's necessary. But it's always being transparent. I'm going to take your stuff and I'm going to put it on the internet. Is that okay? And then we negotiate about how to do that, how to do it, as opposed to not revealing really what I'm doing. So I'm trying to be both following the letter of the law and the intent. The intent really matters. Yeah.
So an argument might be, what is the better way for increasing knowledge? Copyright and patents, or to let it be free? And since you make something and I learned from you, I have the pressure to make it better, which causes you to increase. There's a philosophy of that way that actually patents and copyrights limit knowledge because you're allowed to camp on your idea. And I think we're going to see more of it. You can't contain this anymore because of the internet, because of AI. It doesn't belong to you anymore. I think that's the future. AI says it doesn't belong to you, it belongs to the community. Yeah, it's going to be enough time.
I think you're hitting on all these, I think, fundamental concepts that are about knowledge creation, about value, about ownership, about common good. And what I've really seen is there are really different perspectives from European perspectives as well as North American, like US perspectives.
So which one is the stingiest?
The Americans.
And I'm a corporate finance person.
Yeah, the United States, and there's a strong argument for this. The United States has strong copyright laws, patent laws, and the idea is if you're going to drop $1 billion into developing this COVID vaccine, we're going to make sure you get your money back and more, right? We think that is important because you took a huge risk. On the other hand, there's a public good issue.
Government money too.
Right.
So doesn't it belong to the people when you take all these grants? Doesn't it belong to the people? I mean, these are legitimate arguments.
Yeah.
I think that is the future of me. I'm starting to retire, but if you're in your 20s, this is your future. Is
absolutely
ownership.
So you got it. So whose common good is this? So the Europeans have decided that anytime there's government money that comes into our project, they actually require us to publish in open access journals, that the research is open and public, because they're working towards, if it was came from the commons, it should be given to the commons.
Your friend needs to release his stuff, I would argue.
I think so. I think
public
so.
funds to do this research, doesn't it belong to the public? I mean, that's an argument. And also we see over in Asia, the speed at which innovation is coming because they're looking at American ideas and they're making them better by them. Like, within 6 to 12 months. It's phenomenal.
Well, and so I really appreciate this conversation. And just to get to my last slide, I think what you're no. This is perfect. Because I think what you're kind of like highlighting is these overlapping issues, which it's about the rule of law, right? Because we have legal systems we have to balance out. There's also this issue of respect, right? Which is we have to kind of respect individual perspectives, which is, hey, I think if it's my position and my philosophy that if the public, all us taxpayers pay for it, it should be available to everybody, that is a legitimate argument. And there could be the opposite too. The last thing was just to talk about viability. And that is, I think that's, this is the tough one. This is, I think, one of the hardest ones, which is, so here I kind of asked it to depict, a cozy candlelit medieval study, a Jewish scholar adorned in Islamic garments, which would have been very typical. silk, Islamic garments and silks were prized across all of medieval Europe. In fact, you would often see churchmen would have vestments. So the stuff they would have, the best silks often had all kinds of Islamic adornments on it. There are cases in medieval Spain where the medieval priest would wear a garment that was silk, but it would be written in Arabic on the back. And sometimes it would say, there's no God but Allah. So it's just these weird kind of contortions of history, which is all I know is this is a beautiful silk. And I think it's appropriate for me to wear this to kind of respect, my own religion. So here he's surrounded by all these scrolls and books, and maybe he's starting to contemplate in the same way we're contemplating today. Well, what about the future? What will this look like? Will kind of his writings kind of turn to dust falling on the floor? Or is there some kind of future state where knowledge can be better preserved, maybe in electronic floppy disks, and it'll work perfectly? We don't know, right? So I think this is that constant question, back and forth, really is, can we continue to do like citizen science? I think so. And so my own work is transforming a bit, which is, I totally believe in citizen science, but there's less people involved in it today than there were in the past. So in some sense, what I know is for it to be viable, it has to transform. I have to find new ways of connecting with the public, which is why now I do a lot of work with immersive technology and virtual reality, which is to get people excited about the time period and say, well, the only way we can kind of understand these periods is getting back at the documents. And so even to the point where, we've been building virtual environments where you can be inside there with either augmented reality, like a HoloLens from Microsoft, or something like an Oculus Rift headset, that where citizen scientists could basically roam around a medieval site and then say, oh, I see there's a stack of 15 documents here that need to be looked through. I wonder what's happening in this place. Maybe I should get to work. So in that way, to kind of transform the experience of being in citizen science to be more inclusive, more integrated, even to the point where we thought about, well, then as you start to accumulate all the work that you're doing, maybe you should have like a right to, add embellishments to that world that you've invested in it. So almost like a second life kind of thing in that perspective, where you're building the world that you want. So those are all of my points, and then I'll come to your question right after. So thank you.
Oh, I was just gonna go off one of the last things you said about kind of like putting embellishments in whatever writing or work that someone, whether in the past or now, brings up. How different or alike is that to, say, Twitter, X, Facebook, whatever social media thing now that is putting out, I can put out whatever I want to about anything,
right?
Right. And so like the title of kind of like collaborative research of your presentation, how do we reconcile that thought that you said where, hey, we can kind of embellish and we can put into these things of what we want or how we see things, yet where we're at currently in social media is wild west of anything goes, which means true or not, doesn't matter.
Boy, isn't that the truth, right? I mean, how would you solve the problem? What do you think is the right balance, or is it possible to balance those two things, be integrating folks, but also still having, in essence, standards? Isn't that what a university degree is? A type of standard.
Were there standards back in the medieval stages of scripts and scrolls and finding out information and writing things like checks and balances?
Sure, and then I'll come to your question.
I think we need checks and balances online, right?
We need critical thinking, more logic, more debate skills than just throwing things out and yelling at each other. And if you look at this Renaissance period, they have a structure, and I think you know more than any of us, a structure of how that debate was going to go.
I mean, this is where I think all this stuff gets really fundamental. So this is where I would think ask you to think about really, really deeply about the work that you're contemplating, what you want to be doing, which is why am I doing this? Why am I here? And I'm not saying like here in the room today. I'm saying like, why are you here on Earth? Well, what are you here to do? And to think slowly about that, well, maybe I'm supposed to be here to make sure, like if I'm really here about this issue of like our truths, then how do I make sure that's apparent in my work? How do I, and that's why we have things like we show our work, the citations that we publish our findings, we share our research with each other so that we can actually get at, oh, I can literally see what you did, right? I know the repair was done correctly. You know, it's kind of like, you know, working with a mechanic and, you know, can you show, you know, he said, here's your old part that's broken, and this is why it was broken, here's the new part I put in. I mean, to come full circle back to the question, which is about social media, right? I think what it says is maybe we don't create laws, but we have to have some types of norms.
Yes.
That we agree to certain standards of behavior. How that gets played out, I'm not sure. Sometimes I wonder, even being a public policy person, you know, can our government, you know, meet the challenges? I don't know. It might have to be back up to the citizens again to kind of self-police themselves and try to create better systems.
Well, like you said with citations, I think citations are very important to say, I have studied, but you said back in this time that everybody knew these because there was a certain educated crowd and everybody else really couldn't read, right?
Yeah.
So they were familiar with this literature, these writings. I think citation is important to give credit, but I think you're going to lose the ability to do citations, and we're already seeing it in the last year with AI. It just grabs everything,
Yeah.
and there's very little citation. Now I'm starting to see some of it that will say this came from these following 4 or 5 websites.
One of the things I like is that you use the past to teach about the present, and I think that that's important.
We want to do these circular things. The other thing too is, like, I'm curious with everybody in the room is, I chose to use like image representations because it's one of the oldest forms of education. And if you look at medieval cathedrals, or if you look at Roman stela or buildings, you know, these are carvings that tell stories, right? It's glass that tells stories because most people were illiterate. And so in this way, I'm kind of like acknowledging, like, I don't know, maybe for the last 2,000 or 3,000 years, you know, the reason why we show each other pictures to tell stories is because there's kind of a universal language there that we can tap into. Again, I think, you know, I just encourage you to be creative in your own work. Think about different ways of doing things. I think, and just, you know, some of the concepts back here, just be transparent about what you're doing. So that's why I've said it's in collaboration with DALL-E and ChatGPT. I mean, I don't think there's any problem with doing these things, working with these technologies, as long as you're transparent about what you're doing, and then really check your work. I found that ChatGPT is a people pleaser, and you have to be really strict with it at times.
That may disappear in less than 5 years.
Yeah.
The speed at which the technology is moving is insane. I don't know if anyone's paying attention to AI. It's really quite insane. I've never seen anything like it.
So are there any, yeah, please.
I was just gonna say, to the storytelling piece of it and using imagery, I think the beautiful thing about it is it can be open to interpretation in some capacity as well. You can have your own context, your own values to it, even though it may have a very like central theme.
Yeah.
And I think it lends itself to your point that you were saying that like you can have disagreement, but you're going to respect that.
Yeah.
And so I think it kind of marries the two in a way.
Oh, I really like that, because so this is where I really do start thinking about it's all very collaborative, right? So we're collaborating about talking about this image, and AI is trying to collaborate with us to kind of create what we think it is. we start to refine those ideas together. And they're all different interpretations of those. And that's actually a really, really good thing, because the multitude of ideas really kind of facilitates then like creativity, new ideas. In some ways, you don't need copyright anymore because it's such a generative, iterative process that we're all working together. That's where the really cool stuff comes up. Sorry for talking for so long today. Really, really sweet. Thank you.